Shane Kilkelly.
And I'm Kyle Thompson.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. We're back. We're back from our slowdown.
Yes.
And that was it was a bit of a summer slowdown, but we'll talk about that a bit more in this sort of anniversary special for Halloween. Halloween special that we'll probably do. It's just so funny to me that like we didn't intend it to be so, but like the first episode aired on Halloween. I was like, oh, that's cool.
Yeah, well, I feel like, I don't know, maybe there's something vaguely Marxist about Halloween.
Yeah.
Not sure what, but maybe.
Yeah. Well, no, it's the sort of the zombie uprising sort of stuff where that's the horror movie metaphor for the masses and so on. Yeah. Anyway, this time we're starting what is probably going to be a 3-part series, reading Andrew Feenberg's Transforming Technology, which was a book that was released quite a while ago, but this actual edition is from 2002. But I'm led to believe that it's actually a sort of an updated version of a previous book, which is called The Critical Theory of Technology. And Kyle, you're actually familiar with this guy, right?
Yes, I was Andrew Feenberg's MA student. So I spent 2 years with him as my advisor at Simon Fraser University, and so I was in his seminars, and my approach to this book, I think, will be different from everything else we've covered, because I guess it's very close to my own life story, and like I keep calling him Andrew because that's what he preferred to be called in class. But
nice.
Feenberg was a huge influence on me. Really, I guess I was still quite, or very much in my formative years as a MA student, and he had a really big impact on the way I saw the world, and in the way that a really kind of intelligent and inspiring teacher can be, right? So I think that I have my criticisms and questions about this book, and it's an older book, so we have the benefit of hindsight in looking back on it. But the sort of fundamental ideas here really did shape my worldview in the decades after, in about the decade after I finished my MA, and I think were really kind of important in getting me to a place where I could become a co-host on this show.
Yeah. So like this is an important book, and it's an important book for us because like this was one of the first candidates for an episode that we ever sort of talked about, right? Like that way back when we were starting. I'm glad we waited because this is an important work, and it deserves a sort of high quality episode series about it. The ideas are very important, right? Like I think they're still extremely relevant today. 16 years or whatever after the initial publication. They're still kind of rare, right? Like you don't see a lot of this kind of analysis out there. So
the philosophy of technology remains a pretty small subfield of philosophy of technology, and if you're working in that field, you kind of tend to know everybody in the field because it's such a small subgrouping of what is considered philosophy.
Yeah, well, I guess we better get into it. So we're going to be covering the first 3 chapters, which constitute the introduction and the 2 chapters of the first section of the book. In terms of page count, it's almost half the book, though, I think.
Yes.
It's a substantial chunk.
It's really like all of the theory, and then the part that we're not covering is like the case studies and stuff. So it's the densest part of the book, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I guess we'll better get into it. We have chapter 1, the introduction, which is titled The Varieties of Theory. And it sort of opens up with this thing that, we have this sort of idea that technological society is condemned to authoritarian styles of management, to mindless work and alienation and crazy consumption and such. But that the book challenges these cliches. This is an answer to Ted Kaczynski, right? Like, this is no, Ted, you were actually wrong. Technological societies can be reformed. It is possible to change this stuff. And like a core part of his argument is that like a lot of these problems are down to the anti-democratic values that govern technological development. That it's a lack of democracy that causes these problems, not anything kind of intrinsic to technology itself.
Yeah, and this is specifically a thing that he refers to called operational autonomy. And that is the power to make strategic choices between different sorts of rationalizations without taking into account like externalities, customs of practice, what workers want or think, or the impact of the technology on sort of broader society. So, this is a thing that he identifies with those in power, basically the management, and in the case of a capitalist society, like the capitalists, right? It is characteristic of capitalism that capital is able to accumulate without any reference to the destruction it wreaks outside of the profit gains that it can have, right?
Yeah, and this is also sort of an answer to the that sort of accelerationist bit as well about like the autonomy of capital. And capital as an intelligent alien force that moves all of its own, and it's like not really. I mean, the operational autonomy is rooted in social interests, and it's an encoding thereof. It's not a sort of a truly autonomous kind of force.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. Is that it's not truly autonomous. Like it is. It is alien in the sense that it is a self-reproducing social logic, but it is nevertheless not alien in the sense that the accelerationist really thought it was, right? Like where it's literally just like this kind of Lovecraftian horror thing that has come from some weird outer dimension to alter the course of history. And even of humanity, right? To turn us into some kind of weird, inhuman, unimaginable Terminator beings. Like, I feel like you really don't get that sense from transforming technology.
No, you in fact get something quite different where it's like that humanity and technology are entangled phenomena where, the tools, we shape the tools and then the tools shape us. And there's nothing truly alien about it,
It's basically optimistic in that sense about the direction of technological and social development, right?
Yeah, and it's certainly optimistic. Like it maintains this kind of hope for the possibility of change and transformation and. Especially like against the and especially like he calls out particularly the end of history sort of thing as being a that foreclosing of those kind of horizons, and this is all sort of an argument against that, which is pretty wonderful. We get sort of introduced to our first sort of big core ideas here, the notions of instrumental and substantive theories of technology. Which are two existing sort of old school sort of ways of looking at technology, which Feenberg will propose an alternative to once he's explained what's going on there.
Yeah, it's the good old here is theory A, here's theory B, here's how they both are wrong.
Yeah.
Set them up and knock them down.
It's a recurring theme throughout this whole sort of book that Feenberg is either answering the incompleteness of previous theories or he's finishing off thoughts for people where a given thinker got a lot of the way there and then couldn't really finish it off. And Feenberg comes along with the missing piece of the puzzle that sort of makes a coherent alternative argument possible. This book is also like it's super dense, but it's actually a pretty relatively easy read. Like, Feenberg is a good writer. It's very clear.
Yeah, Feenberg is a really clear writer, especially for a philosopher. And I can say from having been in his seminars, he's also extremely good at explaining difficult concepts, like even just in speech, in class. Like, it is a talent of his, and it really comes through in this book.
Yeah, so, I mean, do you want to start us off with the instrumental and substantive theories?
Yeah. So the instrumental theory is really about the sort of common sense notion of technology that comes down to us in the modern world, right? That technology is value free. It's the classic guns don't kill people, people kill people argument, right? That it's indifferent to the ends to which it's put. It's indifferent to the politics for which it is used. You know, to just further that analogy, doesn't really matter if a fascist or a communist is using a rifle, it still shoots people, right? And the actual like structure and logic of technology is rational. It's based in nature, right?
It's an embodiment of some natural, neutral, rational value. It's just a concretion of that neutrality.
Right. Like, you know, again, to take another example, the Soviets and the Americans were both building rockets to go into space, but the fundamental premises of rocketry were the same between them, right? Like the social logic at face value does not seem to enter into the technical considerations, right? And what this means is that there is a universal criterion of efficiency that applies to all technology, because there's only one sort of map that technology can be built with. And so the question is just like, given the design or the design purpose of the technology, how well do you achieve it, right? How fast does your train go? How many people can you carry? All that kind of stuff. It's indifferent to its social context. That is something that only shapes the uses to which it is put, not its design on any fundamental level.
Yeah. And this is pretty widely believed as well. Like, this is a default position for a lot of people. Just like, no, of course technology is neutral. Why wouldn't it be? You know.
Yeah, well, because it has a certain kind of common sense validity to it, right? Like, you can just give examples like the ones that I just gave, and people will say, "Oh yeah, makes sense."
Yeah, well, except for Feenberg, right? Like, he'll get into, you know, that it's not an accident that the gun, you know, has the trigger towards the firer and the opening towards the target. You know, that's like there's in fact an encoding of value in the design of the instrument itself, right? You know, but that we'll get to that much later.
Yeah, there's sort of numerous levels at which interests factor into the design of technology. It's just that they're not, it's when you give those kinds of very simple, like one artifact doing one thing examples, it is easy to imagine that the instrumental theory of technology is correct. And to the point that a lot of engineers tend to sort of buy into this theory, like sort of screen out the inconsistencies in their experience that don't agree with this. So the fundamental point here, though, is that technology can be limited by non-technical factors, but it can't be transformed by them. So we can choose to say, do we want to use nuclear power, or do we not want to use nuclear power? It doesn't make any difference to the way a nuclear power plant operates. It's just a question of whether we'll use it or not, and for what purpose, Like, are we going to use a nuclear power plant to build to make fuel for nuclear weapons, or are we going to use it for peaceful power creation, or are we not going to use it at all? Those are social decisions which are kind of obviously involved, but they make no difference to the principles of nuclear power engineering at first glance.
Yeah. Just something that popped into my head there is it's a lot like the sort of choice in a video game of like, do you use the shotgun or the plasma rifle? It's like you can choose one or the other, but never influence the actual design of either. You know, that like it's purely about usage and non-usage. That like you can take it or leave it, but never have any other kind of say in it. Yeah. Yeah, but like in contrast to that, you have the substantive theory of technology, in which technology isn't neutral, and it sort of forms a cultural system and structures the entire social world. You can usually structure it as an object of control, right? This is a kind of like the objection on the sort of basis of like, oh well, that technology structures the world in sort of ways that are controlling and harmful. And it's a sort of also like this expansive and invasive notion of technology as like spreading like a virus into the society. Pessimistic and sort of apocalyptic usually, and mystifying. Like, I mean, I mentioned Kaczynski earlier, but like that was the core of what he was talking about. That like, you know, that technological society is a society of domination, and to him there was no way out of that. That was just like, it's doomed because that's just what technology is, and that's what the follow-on effects of technology are.
Yeah, and this is also a theory that's associated with like Martin Heidegger, and you know, informed. Though it was certainly not the only thing, but it informed his involvement with Nazism, right? That as part of this kind of apocalyptic thinking about technology. In his early phase, he was sort of like, well, you know, maybe the Nazis can somehow like stake out a kind of like ideal German non technological dominated society for us. And then in his later phase, he was more like, no, there's like literally nothing we can do as people. Like only a god can save us. So very, very apocalyptic.
Yeah, very much so. There's a sort of decent example here as well to kind of illustrate the difference between the two theories. That like the example of, say, fast food, right? Like that an instrumentalist would look at fast food as pure nourishment without any kind of social complication whatsoever, whereas a substantivist would look at the phenomena of fast food as eventually influencing how the society is structured by, let's say, eroding the tradition of meal times shared by a family, and also that kind of feedback loop where, yes, it is nice to have fast food available when you're in a big rush, but having it available enables rushing and enables a faster pace of life, and there's a kind of a feedback loop between those, and that's what sort of scares the shit out of the substantivists.
Yeah, and there's a way in which substantive theory follows from instrumental theory, because if you have this universal criterion of efficiency, and that becomes the decisive thing in making social choices, then you get into a world of substantive rationality, like in terms of, substantive technological theory, in the sense that like people's choices don't actually matter. The only thing that matters is efficiency, and once that becomes true, then the world becomes a very inhuman place.
Yeah. That's a pretty crucial idea that'll come up again and again, the notion of like efficiency being posited as a sort of universal ranking function that can differentiate between the good and the bad within the technological society.
Yeah, it is, as Weber said, an iron cage of rationalization.
Yeah. But these two theories actually share quite a lot of underlying assumptions in that the assumption is always that technology can't be changed. It's just something you can have more or less of. But yeah, like the next section then to the author talks about like so we mentioned just a little bit before that like for the instrumentalists, like technology can be limited by non-technical functions, but it can never be changed by them. So he's going to talk here about like the ways in which technology is or can be kind of bound and unbound. the historical ways in which societies have tried to limit technology. Yeah, it's really interesting because he splits it into like moral boundaries and political boundaries. Where the sort of on the moral side of it, you have like conservatives bemoaning the kind of erosion of organic culture and spiritual values and that sort of thing, and then the reaction is kind of a call for like a restoration of the holy, like that some things need to be excluded from the technological realm in order to maintain their sanctity.
Yeah, and like you see a lot of this in actual philosophy of technology, that many philosophers of technology are not really like Feenberg. Like Feenberg is a little bit of an oddball in the field of philosophy of technology, in the sense that like he's a Marxist, whereas most philosophers of technology kind of fall more into this sort of stuff, where it's like bemoaning the erosion of our organic culture and spiritual values and the holy, right? So like bemoaning the degeneration of society and like the end of shared family meals, right? Like that kind of stuff is quite common in philosophy of technology.
Yeah, it is. This is kind of why we're covering this stuff, because it's a fairly unique perspective on it. But yeah, I mean, the common thread here is always a sort of a return to simplicity or some sort of thing as a kind of reaction to technology. But there's problems here, right? One being the uncritical acceptance of the dominant technological paradigm as being just something that you can have more or less of and never actually change, like we said previously.
Yeah, and I mean, I was going to say, like, this informs a lot of environmentalist thinking too, right? Like, it's this is absolutely. I grew up with a lot of hippies, and this is absolutely the theory of technology they have, which is just like the world's going to the dogs. It's a never-ending encroachment on the natural. All that is holy is being profaned. Mm-hmm.
But like Feenberg has kind of objections to all this sort of stuff, right? That the moral objections don't really work because of a couple of reasons. Like one being that it fails to see any kind of positive potential in technology. Like it fails to see the liberatory potential of new technologies. There's also the issue of like the definition of the domain. Like where's the line? What's inside the realm of technological mediation and what's considered to be outside of it? And it just sort of concedes defeat on the possibility of change. Like that, like. Yeah, I mean, even if you do manage to draw a line somewhere, it's going to move, right? Like, if you've already observed the thing encroaching on your territory, what are you going to do by putting up a fence? Like, it's going to knock down the fence, right?
Yeah, it's kind of like the progressives. So, he talks about progressives like worried about the erosion of civil norms by technology and technocracy, and the need for a restoration of sort of rationality based on debate and discussion and values. And he's very much like talking about Habermas's, Jürgen Habermas's perspective on technology there. And, it's kind of like that view of technology is like, it doesn't really have a good comeback to the substantive theory of technology. It's more like, yeah, but like, what if we just didn't think about that too much, right? Like, maybe things aren't so bad, right? It's kind of the way you end up with that sort of thinking. It's like, yeah, we can draw lines and stuff, but it's like, well, but then how? And like, like, how are you going to draw lines when you live in a society that is defined by international economic competition and the capitalist profit motive? Like, what's the basis for drawing lines? What are you going to do about that? It's like, well, I don't know. It'll just kind of work out. Maybe there's no real good answer.
Yeah, the international bit does relate to the next section, but I want to dwell on this one for just a slight moment longer because it's a variation on that sort of question that I ask primitivists or people who are getting in that direction of like, well, you've seen how this stuff develops into what we have now. Like, if you're saying go back to something simpler, what's your plan for stopping that from developing from something simpler into something more complex, which is the thing you just saw happen? Like, yeah,
100%. Like,
I mean, yeah, by all means, go back to 1970, but you have to realize that 1970 turned into this, right? Like there's a chain of dialectical causation there that led here. So you better have a big. I mean, even Kaczynski didn't really have a plan for that, right? Like he was just like, I don't know, we just go primi and hope for the best, But the notion, of like with international sort of boundaries and stuff, does bring us on to the political boundaries, of which the sort of examples here are of like nations trying to preserve sort of indigenous values while modernizing. And the two examples are pre-war Japan and the Soviet Union. Yeah, which are really, really interesting examples,
So absolutely, it was the case that there was some thought in Japan before the Second World War that was like very sort of oriented around this idea of like Asian technoculture, and trying to stake out a sphere of the world that would be like authentically Asian, led by Japan, that would be able to resist westernization and by extension Western technoculture. And well, in the first place, there's the obvious problem that the Japanese lost the war, but the more sort of like I think the more fundamental problem is that a lot of that sort of like Kyoto school style, speaking about personal history, the people in my department who were writing this stuff at Kyoto University, a lot of their sort of thinking about how an Asian technoculture would work was a little bit fuzzy and kind of a little bit, I think, a little bit too enthralled with the pretensions of empire. And it obviously didn't work, right? Losing the war aside, the theory still seems a little bit dubious.
So there just wasn't much of an alternative there, and nothing sort of materialized.
Well, I mean, it's like, first of all, how do you define Asianness? Right? There's a problem. Second of all, what is the relationship of Asianness to technology, and how does it fundamentally alter the efficiency criterion? Right? It's not like, the Japanese Zero was operating on some radically different principles of aerodynamics than an American Mustang or whatever, right? Like, Japan was still fundamentally involved in a world that was driven by competition and war, and still was fundamentally creating artifacts that were meant to compete on those grounds. So I think that a lot of the theorizing was sort of very like high level abstract stuff, like very much not concrete. These were people who were simultaneously deeply trained in Neo-Kantian philosophy and some like concepts of like Buddhism, but that didn't really, and like we're in an environment of Japanese imperialism and sort of counter-Western political movements, and that didn't really amount to a very good theory of technology, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's interesting, and then like, but that's then contrasted with the Soviet Union, which is the very similar story, but like much more, it's sort of like a future oriented rather than a past oriented thing, right? Like, but the commonality is that like there's sort of two cultures that adopted and intensified capitalist or Western technoculture, or the techniques of it, to try and create a different society, and both kind of ended up more or less failing eventually, and then converging back on just Western technoculture anyway.
And like, in the case of Japan, like accelerating it, or accelerating it, and then sort of coming to kind of redefine Western technoculture, right? Like that boom of Japanese consumer electronics that happened in the 80s sort of became definitive of how we think about consumer technology and cyberpunk in a way, right? So it's not as though it was simply like subordinated to Western technoculture, but it definitely did not create an alternative to it in any kind of deeply meaningful way. Like, maybe in Japan, most appliances talk to you or play little songs. In the West, they don't really do that. Is that a deeply meaningful distinction? I don't really think so, right? No. Like, does the existence of fancy Japanese toilets does that mark out a fundamentally distinct technoculture? No, I don't think so. Not really.
But at this point, the instrumental theory basically collapses, right? That because if technology were truly neutral, then it should be able to serve all kinds of different ends. But this convergence suggests otherwise, right? And the substantivists see the convergence as evidence that there is no alternative, right? And so the two theories only really differ in sort of attitude towards the same sort of outcome ultimately, which kind of sucks.
Right, and it does this, the sort of the failure of the Japanese imperial project, and I don't know if there's anything particularly Asian or Western about conquest and war and imperialism. I don't think there is, but it is obviously the case that in the effort to establish this sort of independent Asia, Japan blatantly copied the sort of methods and ideas of Western imperialism and caused enormous violence and destruction across Asia in a way that isn't really distinguishable from the way that the Europeans went around and killed and enslaved many people. So it's it feels like in the case of the Soviet Union, it's kind of like you get these arguments that are sort of like the worst forms of tanky discourse, right? Where it's like, well, but Stalin did it, therefore, or that's the sort of crudest form of instrumental theory. It's no regard for what actually happened or how you could contextualize that. It's just who was using the technology, who was enacting the policy. That's all that matters. Yeah. Because obviously Stalin had, fundamentally different values, and therefore everything he did was pretty much A-okay. Yeah. That is some dubious theorizing.
Yeah, very. And in reaction to dubious theorizing, Feenberg's going to try and develop a critical theory of technology, which argues an actual alternative based on public participation in technological decisions. Because another commonality between these examples is that they're both examples of state-sponsored imposition on the technical process and excluded, popular participation. And this is the core of Feenberg's argument that technology can be transformed into you can transform into a different society, a different modern society, right? That's the crucial one, right? That it's a modern alternative to capitalism, but only really on the basis of mass participation in the design of the technical base, which was not the case for these two examples.
Yeah, because the fundamental thing that was common between the Soviet Union, the Japanese Empire, and sort of baseline Western capitalist technoculture was this top-down control, the use of technology as a means of establishing top-down control for the purposes of strengthening the state and growing the capital base, right? So because it's this problem with the instrumentalist theory where it's the state has values, the state will enact values, and then you say, well, how is the state going to enact values? Well, it's going to tell everybody what to do. It's okay. well, it has values, all right, but then how is it actually going to make those values effective? And it's going to be through creating tools that build up the technical power of the state through means of sort of like top-down control, to enact the agenda. But in the end, the means end up sort of overstripping what the agenda was in the first place.
And it is just it's a recapitulation of capitalism, right, basically. And it's like that's the authoritarian structure of technology and capitalism. So convergence over time, you just end up back there anyway.
Yeah, and this isn't to say that there's no distinctions between these cultures, right? It's just like, we saw in Red Plenty that there were plenty of peculiarities of the Soviet system, right, that are not common to our experience or to the American experience at the same time. But I think what Feenberg does say is essentially that the Soviet approach was kind of incoherent, in that it was like trying to implement a socialist political agenda at the same time that it was trying to implement a capitalist modernization agenda. Right, and those two things just like fundamentally did not cohere together.
Yeah. So moving on to the next section, then, the answer to this is that we must create a politics of technological transformation, and the initial touch point for this is the kind of critical theory that we get out of kind of coming out of the Frankfurt School. And I'm not familiar. I'm not actually really familiar with these guys at all. So can you kind of explain what the basis for this is?
Sure. So. The critical theorists were people basically associated with the Frankfurt School. Was it Frankfurt School for Social Research or something like that? Which was originally set up as kind of like a social analysis think tanky kind of shop, but which drew together a number of people, especially the ones who went on to be famous, because there were other people there. They just kind of got swept under the rug, that were like pretty much like neo-Kantian philosophers who also were Marxists. And they looked at sort of the ideas of neo-Kantian philosophy as the basis for social criticism, right? So philosophy isn't just going to be, a thing that is narrowly confined to the traditional territory of philosophy. It is something that is going to actually provide a sort of theoretical basis for the class struggle, for the realization of the socialist project. And they were not really the only people at that time who had that sort of orientation. But really the sort of fundamental thing about the Frankfurt School that was important was that in going to the U.S., in seeing, the rise of fascism, the Holocaust, the atom bomb, all that kind of stuff, they developed, specifically Horkheimer and Adorno, developed this very pessimistic theory of civilization that was kind of like based on like neo-Kantianism and Hegelianism, and had that Marxist background, but was deeply pessimistic about the way that history was going, because they just seen Germany, this country that was considered to be like the center of civilization and stuff, become this fascist nightmare. And they saw technology, which had been, traditionally for Marxists, the idea of technical progress and social progress were deeply intertwined, right? That like as technology grows, as the means of production become more sophisticated, so too does science become more sophisticated, and therefore so too do we become more enlightened, right? All of that thinking was quite common in the socialist movement before the Second World War, even if people were sort of like shocked by the First World War. But they instead saw like that there was a dialectic of enlightenment, as their book was called, where this, basically the substantive theory of technology, like technical progress and social progress became unlinked. And technical progress has gone on to create this kind of monstrosity that is now taking over the world, where rationality itself has become perverted, right? And then how can we possibly criticize the world as it is if we cannot do so rationally? Like, if rationality itself is perverted, what are we going to do? And like these sorts of problems and these kinds of concerns and questions were really what made the Frankfurt School famous. And the specific connection to Feenberg is that he was a student of Herbert Marcuse, who was one of the younger members of the Frankfurt School and was influenced by Adorno and Horkheimer, and who went on to become a sort of major figure in like the 60s student movement, as like an elder statesman kind of, because he first of all sort of like used Adorno and Horkheimer's critique of society to develop this theory of one-dimensionality, that, society was just like everything was subverted to the reproduction of the capitalist system according to a very narrow and inhumane definition of rationality. And he was calling desperately for some kind of rational critique of rationality, some kind of next level of critique that could take us away from that narrow definition that had just railroaded us down this inhuman path, and create a sort of meta level of rationality that would be able to criticize that society and create a better world. So that really struck a chord with people in the 60s, and including Feenberg himself.
Yeah, he's picking up the torch, right?
Yeah, who became Marcuse's student and went on to sort of develop Marcuse's theories of technology in a more sort of like concretely sophisticated way.
Yeah, and that's what he ends up with here. He's sort of outlining a bit of the sort of the gist of the critical theory of technology, which is going to pick up the torch from there. And it resembles substantive theory in that, technology isn't neutral. It shapes us and we shape it, and it shapes our future choices. And choice is a kind of a key word here, right? Because the choices made become embodied in the technology and in the technical infrastructure. And so the use of the thing is no longer value free because it sort of represents a choice that was made. And as we'll get to later, probably in chapter 3, it sort of also represents the keeping open of a further choice on the behalf of a particular set of personal interests that is constantly reproduced in the system. So yeah, I mean, the technical development isn't autonomous. It's shaped by human action. So it's like, yeah, it's a rejection of that kind of fatalism as well. It's sort of an agreement with instrumentalism in a way that, like, it rejecting fatalism entirely, disagreeing with instrumentalism in that technology isn't actually neutral. So it's kind of it feels like a kind of synthesis of the positions,
Yeah, and for Marcuse, the sort of fundamental problem was that he felt like other members of the Frankfurt School, that the working class had become integrated into capitalism completely, because capitalism delivered the goods, quote unquote, in terms of like consumer goods and a comfortable life and all this stuff. Remember, this is at the height of Fordism that he's writing. The workers had no actual critical role to play. And so he looked to sort of like minorities, but also just like the student movement as people who like could identify within this techno structure itself something oppressive that they could react against. And yeah, at some points he was kind of more in the substantivist theory. In some points he kind of gestured more towards like the things that Feenberg developed. Yeah,
and I guess sort of moving on to the next section, the kind of we're sort of introduced to these sort of notion of like, yeah, that like the use of technologies kind of denotes kind of like civilizational types and kind of like types of people. Is the argument that sort of like, yeah, that like against contra the sort of instrumentalism, that like the use of technology and the pursuit of a given technical path kind of just defines a person as being a part of a kind of civilization within the system. There are many publics within the system. Your interaction with the technosphere and your use of it puts you in one or the other sort of categories.
Yeah, I mean, this feels like pretty similar to the sort of like varieties of capitalism kind of argument, or like a lot of, like, I remember Feenberg, for example, wrote some case studies about how like the Japanese technostructure varies from other technostructures, like, looking at case studies of like, well, there's this interesting kind of arrangement in Japan. It's not to say that it's not like fundamentally part of a capitalist system. It's just like there are varieties of capitalism. There are varieties of feudalism, right? Like not looking at the mode of production as a monolith, looking at it as more of a kind of hodgepodge or an assemblage. Not a term used here, but I think it fits.
It fits, yeah, it definitely does. There's also the notion of the ambivalence of technology is kind of important here as well. That like, yeah, there's the social. Feudalism kind of flowed from its material base, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there was only one kind of feudalism. And the same goes for all sorts of different societies, and that kind of keeps the door open again for a different kind of modernity that isn't the capitalism we know, right?
Right, which was really the kind of like logic that those Soviet people and Japanese people were seizing on. The theorists were seizing on, was like, well, we can have something different. It's like, yeah, but it's not different in a fundamental sense, right? So it's like, it's kind of like evidence. I think that at the time this was written, or slightly before that, in like the 90s, there was a lot of sort of interest in this idea just because the notion of there is no alternative was so oppressive, and the notion of the Washington Consensus was so oppressive, that to find any kind of variety in the world at all was, in a way, promising, right? It gave some hope that there might be something different that could happen, because it just showed that no, it's not homogeneous. There is difference in the world. So yeah.
Yeah, there's a couple of really wonderful bits here that kind of do point towards those kinds of points of rupture. The first being, the one that jumps out to me is that, like, if a different technological civilization won't emerge from ethics or politics, then it has to emerge from some distinction that's immanent to the system itself. And there's an obvious one, which is the distinction between those who command and those who obey. So the distinction of power as the site of rupture for this change. And this is like really, really crucially important. And it's especially important to kind of like help shoot down the instrumentalists as well, that like technology is a two-sided thing, right? Like that there's an operator and an object, right? And then when both the operator and the object are people, then the use of technology is inherently a exercise of power. It is inherently political when you're operating on other people as the object. That's just wonderfully put.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. This is really the fundamental point that Feenberg is making about criticizing both the sort of instrumentalists and substantive theories. Is like, we can look at something within technology, the domain of technological operation, that is not just about efficiency, right?
Yeah, definitely. This is, resistance is going to be challenged to the hierarchy, the kind of the lay actors of the system versus the institutionalized power. And so he brings us on to he starts to lean on two theorists, Descartes and Foucault. Did I get those right?
Yep.
Cool. Yeah. Not familiar. I'm sort of semi-familiar with Foucault, but I'm not familiar at all with Descartes. But yeah, we get introduced to this really fantastic term, right? The operational autonomy at this point, which is the strategic standpoint of management.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it.
It's just excellent.
Yeah, that management, because it has operational autonomy, is able to act strategically, which is to say, at a broad scale, right? We were talking about earlier in this series, sort of like the war of position, war of maneuver. If you're operating strategically, you're directing that war, right? Like you're operating in many different theaters or many different situations at once. This is the perspective of sort of like high command,
Yeah, it's and the sort of opposite of it is the tactical standpoint of the managed, right? Like which is richer and more complex, and is embedded and embodied within this this world of technology. So you have the managers on high doing the strategic stuff, but the sort of managed in the trenches actually engaged with the technology directly. And this sort of two-sided view of it tells us a lot more than substantivism does. This is vastly more useful.
Yes. Yeah, because the substantive theory of technology really can only see the sort of strategic level of operation. Does not really have the resolution to look down into this kind of tactical perspective. And I mean, you know, it is certainly the case that operating at the level of tactics is inferior to operating at the level of strategy.
Yeah.
If you can only operate at the level of tactics, like, well, yeah, you won the battle but lost the war, right? That's the fundamental distinction. And, you know, Desserteau was very much aware of that distinction, but I think this theory was kind of come up with at a point of such fundamental reactionary strength and the failure of left movements that it was really like a theory of how can we get anything at all? How can we even resist? Like what can we even cling on to? So, you know, it's right to say, well, hey, but if you can only do tactics and not strategy, you're probably in trouble. But it's better than nothing.
It is, but the promise here is that like that the tactics could become strategy by...
Yeah, but we're going to get to that later, right? It's sort of at the basic level of this metaphor. It's clear that, like, yeah, one person is kind of in the broader level of control, and then the other person is in the sort of like trying to make the best of a bad situation.
Yeah, and there's a sort of nice kind of section here about a sort of a culture of responsibility that like we sort of the present hegemony sort of presumes that, you know, workers can't possibly be interested in the running of things, but that's only because that's the way things are now, right? That like a culture of responsibility rather than a culture of mass participation is actually possible, and that, like, you know, the passivity that we sort of see in the kind of third way welfare state sort of arrangement of social democracy isn't the actual natural state of human beings. It's, you know, a historical contingency. Different is possible. That's the kind of the ringing sort of call through this whole thing, is that, you know, different is possible, and that like we can actually have it's important that he puts emphasis on a coherent alternative configurations of modern civilization, because he's not talking about primitivism. He's not talking about some sort of like conceptually incoherent sort of idealist sort of thing. It's like, no, we can have a coherent alternative that isn't, you know, immiseration by collapsing back to a pre-lingual state. You know?
Yeah, because, you know, if we have a culture of responsibility, it means that workers must act rationally for the system to continue, right? Like there's it's this kind of thing that you see a lot in the Frankfurt School of like this kind of desire or call for like a return to or a creation of like mass rationality, right? And so, you know, if we were able to create the culture of responsibility successfully, then yeah, we would be operating at the level of strategy, right? Eventually, it's just that's the goal.
Yeah, it's good stuff. I mean, this is invigorating reading, right? Like it's kind of nice to have an argument against Ted, right? You know,
yeah,
pretty much.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, like and you know, if you read The Dialectic of Enlightenment, it's an incredibly pessimistic book. So it's nice to have a response to something like that too, which isn't just like, oh, things aren't that bad. Like those kinds of like, I don't know, sort of like weak denials of the premise are so much less satisfying than actually coming up with a theory like this that has some more sophistication and analytic strength to it.
It has teeth, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, sort of moving on to the next bit, humanism and history. We get Feenberg has this really great argument here that human societies should be about enabling fulfillment for all and human flourishing, but that the technical arrangements of the current society actually place limitations on human development more so than they free them up. But yeah, he's got this kind of nice thing here that well, what's all this human fulfillment bit about? What's all this stuff about capacities? Well, like that, and that there aren't really any absolute answers, and all we really have is this unfinished history with a bunch of signposts along the way, such as emancipation struggles, universal education, suffrage, and various progressive cultural changes, and like the emergence of individuality and individual expression. That we're the products of this kind of winding history of unfolding capacities. And we sort of recognize the new struggles that are still being fought, right? Like this is just sort of like imminent to who we are. That like we don't like chains, we rattle against them and struggle to break free, and then we recognize what the new chains, the remaining chains are, and we recognize those and struggle to break free of those again. It's this historical unfolding of capacities. But he gets kind of into really interesting sort of definitions of like how these kind of new demands are manifest, right? And the term he introduces is participant interests, is one of the ways this articulates. Yeah, it's a sort of expression of the interests of people, right? And like recognizing when there's a gap between people's interests and the current sort of code of the society, and opening up this kind of opportunity for reconfiguration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you have noted here that this is like dialectics, right? Well, it is absolutely. This is people using their negative capacity for criticism to identify social problems and overcome them, right? So the fear of people like Adorno or Marcuse was that people no longer had this capacity because the system was so total. But, Feenberg is certainly saying, like, that's not true, right? There is room still for critical thought and for progress on the basis of critical thinking.
And there's always potentiality, right? Like, you can always imagine better, right? Like, it's just a sort of... one of the few things you can ascribe to human nature is that our imagination for slightly better circumstances, and that infinite tension between the sort of actualities of the present and the historical opportunities of the present, and or kind of like compulsion to cross that gap when it's possible to do so. And yeah, we get introduced to another fantastic term, which is the technical code. And it's kind of like condensed, codified interest.
Yeah, so it's basically like because management has operational autonomy, they are able to make choices about how technologies are brought together in such a way that perpetuates their operational autonomy. And that arrangement is the technical code, right? It is this kind of like high level system of technical arrangements, which is the arrangements, but also the norms they imply about what is good design, what is good technically.
Yeah, so it's a way of sort of it's like general solutions to problems, right? Like it's this kind of like quite high level thing. This isn't like the concretion of technologies, right? Like this is a kind of a governing sort of rule structure above it. And yeah, it's like it provides a ranking function for like what is considered good technical activity and how to differentiate between what is permitted and what is not permitted.
Yeah, I know you can kind of think about it similar to like standard operating procedure or like best practices. That sort of level of like high, general encompassing technical arrangements and practices.
And because it's so high level, it's hard to argue against often, it's hard.
Yeah, it's often missed, right? When people debate technologies, they often get fixated on the artifacts and their very obvious uses and ignore the technical code.
Yeah. So, and it's important here as well that, efficiency is the usual ranking function that is kind of posited for this stuff. That we will sort different solutions from each other according to their efficiency. But, efficiency isn't the only actual criterion, right? That's the kind of thing, there's a sort of a mystification going on here where the official line is that, we'll decide between different technical solutions based on their efficiency, but there's also this criterion of whether the solution fits the sort of overall interests of the people who kind of determine the technical code.
Yeah, who defines efficiency, right?
Yeah. So there's examples here where there's there could be two solutions, two solutions of equal efficiency, one that applies worker skills and one that eliminates them. So that the tiebreaker will go to the one that serves capital interests, even if it's just as efficient even if it's just as efficient to empower the workers, you'll still get the disempowerment because that's.
Or even if it's more efficient.
Aha, yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Because operational autonomy is the most important thing. So even if he gives some examples where it's implementing the technology that would empower workers would be lower cost and more efficient, but it would impair the power of management, or it would at least appear to impair the power of management. And this is very much getting back to the argument that Graeber makes, right, about flying cars and falling rate of profit, that there has been, or that the design choices that are made at a general social level are always towards the end of maintaining what Feenberg calls operational autonomy, and not towards some alternative criterion of efficiency that could be, say, workplace safety, right? Health and well-being, meaningful lives, all those things, right? Or even just sort of basically technical criteria like speed.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
The workplace safety one is interesting because that's actually kind of related to one of the upcoming kind of sections about how kind of ethical demands are often eventually folded into technical codes because a given interest such as worker safety can't be expressed in terms of the technical code. So the people make an appeal to some transcendental kind of nature to say we ethically we have a right to be safe in the workplace. That will eventually get folded into regulations, which are technical codes, the generalities of regulations. But then they'll eventually be forgotten, right? It'll kind of just disappear into the fabric of the technosphere.
Of course your car has a seatbelt. Of course your car has airbags. Of course your car has a catalytic converter. None of these things used to be standard artifacts of what a car is.
But in general, still though, operational autonomy armors the system against recognition of many different interests. You can only kind of get the technical code to encode some interest usually after a kind of fairly long struggle to make transcendent a kind of an ethical demand, then coupled with the threat of revolution if it doesn't get met or something like that.
Yeah, totally.
But in general, the operational autonomy wins, and we get a touch point here for what would it mean to democratize technology? Well, it would mean re-privileging those excluded publics and their values, right? Allowing those interests to be considered instead of the runaway operational autonomy to be the thing that determines how things turn out.
Yeah, and I mean, you can think about concrete examples say, making accessibility a norm of design, right? That is something that people have had to fight very hard to get whatever encoding they have been able to, right? It's, like in the building code or whatever, that is a technical code, right? Having wheelchair accessibility is something that people had to fight for very hard to get, and so this kind of struggle to privilege, marginalized or excluded publics. It does have effects, but it's very difficult unless you have a democratic control of technology.
Yeah, and speaking of democratic control of technology, the next section kind of is about technical politics, and kind of beginning from the example of Marx, who was like the first proposed the idea that an economy controlled by the workers would be able to design technology such that high skill would be applied to production instead of excluded from production. And that this would be ultimate human empowerment, right? Which is kind of, it's an interesting thing because, like, you get these, like, Silicon Valley techno-accelerationist dipshit utopian kind of guys, and the thing they're imagining is this, like, ultimate fusion of technology with the human into this ultimate empowerment. Except that's the thing that capitalism doesn't deliver. It delivers disempowerment instead, right? Like, if you want to authentically fuse human, like, libidinal skill and productivity with some cybernetic augmentations, you're kind of going to want your communism instead, right? Like,
it's empowerment in the sense of operational autonomy. Right? That's the empowerment they're thinking about. Because, operational autonomy does empower managers and capitalists. It's just not a generalized empowerment.
No, it's a special empowerment for the few, in this kind of classically sort of liberal sense of, like, having this partitioned socius where there's a partition within which you have this kind of autonomy, and there's a partition in which you don't.
It's the steampunk version of empowerment, right? Like, cool neato technologies for rich white dudes.
Yeah. But yeah, in this section we get a bit of a run through of, like, the sort of labor process sort of theory of, like, capitalists imposing labor discipline on the workforce through these kind of technological mediations which privilege de-skilling to exclude skilled workers. But there's a funny bit here where this kind of, like, it sort of, that interest then becomes encoded in, like, education, and thus goes on to shape the entire social life, right? Like, the exclusion and de-skilling is a structuring thing that spreads everywhere. But it's kind of funny as well that, like, they kind of want highly skilled and also highly unskilled workers. There's a fundamental tension inside of capitalism there.
Yeah, it is a fundamental tension that you want to be, you want your workers to be maximally capable and maximally subservient, and you can't have both at the same time. So that's why you get things like stratification of the education system, right? Like white collar workers, and, like, different levels of universities which have different levels of development of human capacities. Like, if you work or if you attend a low-level university, they'll probably give you some vocational training and just a sort of, if you're lucky, some kind of passing reference to some of the intellectual heritage of humanity, some of the general intellect that might actually enrich your life. If you go to a highly privileged, highly resourced university that is designed to create leaders and elites, then you'll probably be given a very deep appreciation of these things.
Well, it's because you're intended to enter into the operationally autonomous sphere. Yeah, that's the intention there. It's the replication of interests again.
And there's kind of a continuum between those two poles, right? So there's a stratification of the workforce between people who are supposed to act like work animals, and people who are supposed to act like these brainy commander types. Very, very Brave New World, right?
Very, very, very shitty. Not the thing we want.
Yeah,
because it is limiting actual human flourishing, right? Like, this is not a system that actually empowers things.
Yeah, I mean, as a educator at a low level university, I feel this pain on a very deep level.
But there's one small section here before we get on to like a quite a meaty one that we should spend a bit of time on. There's just this bit about like reconceptualizing socialism as the possibility for like mixed economies, combined markets and socialism, like state control to like take over stuff and guarantee human flourishing. It reminds me a little bit of the stuff we had in Markets in the Name of Socialism, and I think in which we gave those sort of ideas a pretty thorough going over. But Feenberg does kind of end that section on a kind of very pragmatic note that, like, I mean, even if we do want to end up in full communism, like that, we're not there yet, and so realistically, the next immediate step is going to be some variety of mixed economy. So yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah, I think the idea is like, rather than the scenario where, and like he'll get into this later, but rather than the scenario where you have the revolutionary vanguard get into power and then like implement by fiat a democratic technological agenda, as you know, in the sort of standard communist model, what we need is more continuity, right? Where democratization is something that is continuous with the political struggle rather than simply a product of the political struggle, because that's just not going to work, right? I mean, because it's not like government political activists have some kind of magic power that allows them to, implement democratized technologies that have been designed and prototyped and worked out by fiat. They have to deal with the existing technostructure. So if the development of the technostructure in some kind of democratic direction is not continuous with the revolutionary process, it becomes an almost insurmountable problem. And I think a really good example of like what does it look like to combine redevelopment of the technostructure with the revolutionary process would be, for example, like the Project Cybersyn stuff we talked about with Stafford Beer, right? It wasn't perfect, but this idea that the technological revolution had to be in sync with the political revolution was absolutely part of the ideology there.
Yeah, and it's good. It's great. This is the stuff we're into. This is and this gives so much answer to I don't know, like what you get out of a lot of contemporary, I don't know, Leninists or whatever, of like kind of quibbling about vanguard sort of stuff or whatever, and like it seems to be a lot of people are still stuck on this idea of like instantaneous revolutionary transformation or whatever. This is not that, right? Like this is transformation as an emerging process, and one that is ongoing, rather than like a kind of you march into the big city square and you wave red banners and you take over and it's great,
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's the case that you could implement a revolution in the technical sphere and that would be sufficient, or that you could get there by means of just sort of like, incrementalism through like, I don't know, union bargaining or something. But it's still nevertheless important that there are capacities out there in society to make those kind of changes in the event that a political revolution is successful, right? If they're not there, it's just a non-starter. It's just a complete non-starter.
Yeah, really is. So yeah, I mean, the last sort of section of this chapter is kind of a meaty one, in which Feenberg gives a sort of a fair hearing and kind of a shoot down to some of the other radical alternatives, and explains why he's maybe not on board for them, and like kind of reinforces some of the points of his critical theory. He begins with the sort of talking about like the post-humanist alternative, and he kind of opens with like talking about like potentialities, how like it's a thing we've been talking about so far, but like suppressed potentiality within the current system, and that like can we have a radical stance without that notion of potentiality, which I believe is a notion that is lost in the post-humanist sort of discourse. But I'm not actually all that familiar with I found this quite a hard section to read, so I'm gonna hand over to you to maybe explain some of what's going on here.
Okay. So I think that this is definitely taking up that kind of humanist critical theory perspective. It's got a little bit of basis in Aristotle, a little bit of basis in Marx, a little bit of basis in Kant, a little bit of basis in Hegel. A little bit of all that. And it's saying that there is a characteristic of human thought which allows it to imagine the world to be otherwise and to come up with negative critiques of what exists. And that is something that is sort of fundamentally human. And it is a basis for the articulation of, say, new human rights, right? That is an avenue towards liberation. Humans can identify their needs that are not met by the current situation, and can work to have those needs recognized and fulfilled. And so this is something like a transcendental horizon for social criticism. Something that doesn't actually exist in this world, but can exist in thought. And Feenberg looks at posthumanism in sort of two varieties, both the sort of like posthumanism that's associated with Haraway, kind of cyborg feminism kind of ideas, and also looks at the quote-unquote posthumanism of actor network theory, right, where you have, like, this is associated with Latour, and it's basically a method for looking at particular situations and sort of deconstructing the assumptions of the human, looking at things we would typically consider to be objects to be acted upon by human beings, and acknowledging how they are actants like people, that there's a kind of equality between humans and things within the network.
Like humans, nature, and technology are like kind of indistinguishable from each other.
Yes, in the sense that they are all actants, they become largely indistinguishable from each other. And so the main point that Feenberg is making here is to say none of this provides the same kind of potential for critique and articulation of social change and recognition of social change that you get with an acknowledgement of what is special about human thought and human rationality. Now, I think as far as a critique of actor network theory goes, that is 100% valid. I think it's a completely fair critique, because I have never seen once convincing use of actor network theory to provide a meaningful social criticism. It's very good at sort of questioning our hubris, right? But as far as sort of like criticizing serious social problems, or like getting beyond kind of micro situations that are really neat and let you write papers, not super fantastic. And so so it's kind of skepticism and hyper micro focus make it a very poor candidate for saying, hey, maybe slavery is bad.
Yeah.
Right?
So the example, Feenberg uses an example here of like an Amazonian tribe where the belief is that men turn into jaguars after they die and women just disappear, and that in this actor network thing, the Amazonian feminist has absolutely nothing to point towards as a transcendent position to like defend her case for a better status in the afterlife, because it's all swallowed in the network, and the only thing that matters is the interrelation of the objects, and there's nothing special about her, so she's fucked. It's just, no, you're never going to get a better position in that society because there's nothing you can point towards that leads out.
Yeah, which is it's a very strange example. like on so many levels. It's such a weird example. Like, who is this Amazonian tribes person who is literate in actor network theory and also neo-Kantian philosophy? Like, this is very weird. But
but I think the point is that, like, it's a common sense. In this example, it would be a normal reaction for the woman, the Amazonian feminist here, to say, "No, I'm a human being. Cut the bullshit. I also get to turn into a jaguar." There's a natural and just common sense way in which we appeal to things outside of the immediate network of stuff in order to make a point.
Well, and I mean, she could use her reason to say, hey, as far as I can tell, you men are not becoming tigers.
That too, right?
Right.
But the point is that within the actor network theory, all of that is impossible. Essentially,
it's impossible because there's no standpoint to make such a criticism, and there's no privileging of a certain relationship between reason and nature.
All highly problematic.
Yeah. So I will say that I definitely was interested in this critique because we have talked a lot about cybernetics. We've talked a lot about sort of post-human stuff on this podcast, and it's really good to see this kind of like deep criticism of that whole mode of thinking. And I have gone and like tried to look at some alternatives, post-human alternatives or critical post-human alternatives that have been written since this book was written. And it does seem like there are some responses to what Feenberg is saying. It's just the kind of stuff he's criticizing at the point of development it was at that point in time was susceptible to this kind of critique. And it's not to say that there aren't holes in the perspective that Feenberg is advancing either.
Yeah, sure.
But I think we'll get to those when we talk in more depth about critical post-humanism.
Yeah, we have something lined up for that at some point later. I guess maybe my sort of... I had a little bit of difficulty with this section because of its kind of like... I get kind of weirded out when there's kind of appeals to... transcendent stuff, because it often feels like it's going to be some appeal to a divine nature or something.
Oh yeah.
Whereas I think the thing that's being appealed to is this is where I get tripped up because I'm just not immersed in the philosophical sort of terminology enough. But like appealing to the human mind's ability to generate scenarios that are different from the current actuality feels like an immanent property of the mind, not a transcendent one. But I mean, I get what you mean when it's like it's transcendent because it points outside of the...
it's transcendent of the existing state of affairs. That's what it's transcending. So
I quite like I guess I was reading a thing about like kind of post-nihilist sort of philosophy or praxis or whatever, and one of the things there was that like even after you've given up on transcendent truths or like kind of metaphysical sort of truth or whatever, you're still left in a world in which you have ample evidence that humans are strange. You know, there's just a practical sort of thing to it of like imminently to the behavior of human beings. You just understand that there's something odd about these things, and that's enough to carry an argument for the specialness of humans. You know, so I'm a little bit sort of aware, and like I think also like I mean we agree with so much of this post-human sort of stuff in the kind of like the need to acknowledge non-human things as being valid and real, because I think we have mounting evidence that the privileging of the human subject is fucking disastrous. You know, that too. You know?
And I mean, there are a lot of sort of points of criticism we could get into here of the perspective that Feenberg is advancing, but I think just to sort of state the case of the critical theorists or of these like, you know, sort of neo-Kantian influenced people, they would appeal to aesthetic norms. Like this is what Marcuse did, right? That the problem with our current civilization is that our conception of reason has become divorced from our conception of what is beautiful. And if we acknowledge and reason on the basis of our conception of the aesthetic, then we could create a world that would be more holistic, less violent, and would take into account non-human value. But it is fundamentally a view that says what we can articulate in thought and language is what really matters. And that means that the only people who can make valuations are people, are human beings, not anything else. That we are spectators who look out on a meaningless world and assign value to it. And the reason why we can make that into something meaningful is because we can use our reason to see in the world something harmonious and beautiful. So that is the kind of critique that was the kind of a Marcusean response to, say, environmentalism, right? Now there are ways you could criticize that perspective, but it's not to say that they simply they have there is no thought in this direction whatsoever, right? So I think we'll kind of dig into this more when we talk about critical posthumanism, because I think it's a really important topic, but it's a huge topic.
Mm-hmm. We don't have the time for it right now. But I suppose, the last bit of this chapter then is about the kind of in contrast to that stuff, the contribution of critical theory. And one of the main contributions, or the kind of fundamental insight, is this the excess of the particular over the universal, right? That the reality is too rich and too complex to be ever fully grasped, which reminds us a lot of the kind of cybernetic ontologies we saw in the cybernetic brain, right?
I think it is. That is true. That is definitely true. It is similar to the viable systems theory in the sense that the particular is in excess of the universal. But I mean, what this really means in layman's terms, in terms of critical theory, is people can articulate criticisms of accepted norms and society, right? When I see an injustice in the world, think about it, and articulate that injustice in language, I am able to make a claim that has validity regardless of what is accepted as generally true. And it's just going back to the thing we just talked about, right? Where we can imagine a different world. Another world is possible, and we can think about it, and those claims are not meaningless.
Yeah, but the inverse of that is domination, where the universal bears down on those judgments and suppresses them, right? That's the
it's like the old Catholic education system or whatever, right? That's the universal suppressing the particular. It's these are the dogmas, you must learn them, and they're incontrovertibly true.
Yeah. So there's this sort of talk of nature here, which I think I kind of maybe didn't quite get what was going on here. But is it sort of the nature of the individual as something kind of external to, or something which escapes the system?
It's the individual's capacity for critical thinking.
Right. Sure.
Right. That we can negate the world as it is in thought. That is what is special about us. That negativity is the core of our capacity to create progress.
Yeah.
In this line of thinking. And
we express that stuff in terms of these kind of universal concepts, right? Of nature and justice and humanity and such.
You can say, for example, make claims hey, actually, women are not naturally less intelligent than men, right? And you can do that on the basis of your reason and your capacity for understanding.
Yeah, and it's these understandings and these objections and these values that are being expressed should be harnessed and historicized and turned into new situations instead of trying to abolish them by pretending that the network or the system totalizes everything and makes these kinds of things impossible, right? It's kind of silly.
Because there is a I mean, this is the problem that he identifies with actor network theory, is like the universal has the principle of inclusion, but it doesn't have the principle of recognizing the excess of the particular, right? Like of the individual. So, and therefore it just becomes a kind of extensive, oppressive network of involvement.
Yeah, and like, it's like that, and because it can't totalize everything, it becomes like frustrated with itself and then tries harder to totalize everything and then still fails to do it. And you just get this like ever spreading repression that never actually manages to succeed fully in bringing about the thing it wants.
I really feel like this is also applicable to a lot of economics.
Yeah.
But yeah, like, you know, a valid answer that we have seen on this show would, for example, be like the viable systems theory, right? Like that it does recognize the excess of the particular over the universal, as you said.
Yeah, exactly. It's very reminiscent of that sort of cybernetic ontology, or just like I don't think that's what Feenberg's trying to get at here, but like I think there's a lot of parallels.
No. I'm just saying it's something that's in that realm of cybernetics that is not susceptible to the criticism that Feenberg's making here.
Yeah. And I suppose, wrapping up, it's sort of like there's this really nice term as well of like dynamic reflexive capacity. That's what humans have as the sort of their ability to resist, and it's kind of a nice way to put it. And
it's kind of like that's all very like rooted in like Aristotle, right? That, you know, it's part of our nature to be thinking things, and we should develop that capacity because it's in our nature to do so. It's our flourishing relies upon the development of our capacity for thought, and that, you know, that's like core sort of humanist values. Yeah,
and that leads back to Feenberg's core point here at the end, that like the technical enterprise can deliver on these potentialities, but the present society kind of artificially truncates that capacity. And the way out is more democratic participation and the kind of like actual worker control of technology. And also that like this kind of crucial final point that like the controlling character of the contemporary capitalist system doesn't exhaust all the potentialities of that technology, right? Like it's an application of that kind of stuff, but it's not the eternal character of technology.
Yeah, because the technical code can be criticized in thought and can be remade if the workers who are involved in it are themselves given the opportunity to develop and implement their ideas.
Yeah, it's good stuff. It's a great chapter. It's a long one. It's doing a big whistle stop tour of a lot of the ideas, but it's really fantastic stuff. I think we covered pretty much all of that. But is there anything else you'd like to get in before we wrap this one up?
No, I think we've pretty thoroughly gone over this chapter. There's really very little left for me to say.
Yeah, it ran a bit longer.
Especially considering we got another 2 to go.
Yeah, we've got another 2 to do. Yeah. But yeah, thanks listeners for putting up with us on this one. And we'll be back in a couple of weeks with chapter 2, where we'll be talking about kind of Marxism specifically, and sort of like transitions to a socialist world. In the meantime, you can catch us on Twitter @GIUnitPod. We're on Facebook if you just search for General Intellect Unit, and we're on all the podcast things, so subscribe if you haven't done so already, all that sort of stuff, or share us with your friends. It's another great way to support the show. And the other way to support the show is to maybe throw us a couple of bucks a month on Patreon. We're on patreon.com/generalintellectunit. It helps to pay for books. It helps to kind of like pay for hosting and stuff like that. And if we ever get rich off of this, we can quit the day job and do this full time, and we won't be in such a rush to get through the reading.
Yeah, you'll have more philosophy of technology than you know what to do with.
Indeed, yeah. Could go weekly then. Go twice a week. I don't know. I think there's a limit to the velocity you can achieve with a lot of this sort of material. Like, it'd be hard to get through this much quicker. Anyway, yeah, we'll catch you again in a couple of weeks. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.
Bye.